Jacob Ellis had been stacking sugar barrels for 12 years when the floor began to shake that October night in 1842. The massive wooden casks, each weighing 300 pounds when full, started rolling across the mill floor without anyone touching them. They moved in perfect formation, circling the grinding stones like dancers following an invisible conductor. The other workers scattered into the darkness, their screams echoing across the sugarcane fields. When the sun rose the next morning, Jacob was nowhere to be found, and those 20 barrels sat arranged in a flawless circle around the mill. Their placement so precise it looked like something beyond human comprehension had orchestrated it. The master searched for 3 days, the overseers turned the plantation upside down, but Jacob Ellis had vanished as completely as morning mist over the bayou. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The Beaumont Plantation sprawled across 2,000 acres of rich Louisiana soil just north of Baton Rouge, where the Mississippi River curved through the land like a sleeping serpent. Randolph Beaumont inherited the estate from his father in 1838, along with 63 enslaved people who worked the sugarcane fields from dawn until the stars appeared in the humid night sky. The plantation house stood 3 stories tall with white columns that gleamed in the sunlight, a monument to wealth built on the backs of people who would never walk through its front doors as anything but servants. Jacob Ellis arrived at Beaumont Plantation in 1830, purchased at an auction in New Orleans for $800. He was 20 years old then, tall and powerfully built with hands that could grip an axe handle for hours without tiring. His mother had been sold away when he was 14. His father worked to death in a rice field in South Carolina, and Jacob carried the weight of their absence in the quiet way he moved through the world. He rarely spoke unless spoken to, kept his thoughts locked behind dark eyes that seemed to look past the present moment into something distant and unknowable. The sugar mill operated from October through January, the grinding season when the cane had to be processed before it spoiled. Those 4 months turned the plantation into a realm of endless labor where the enslaved workers slept only 3 or 4 hours each night, their bodies moving through exhaustion into a kind of waking dream. The mill building stood near the river, a wooden structure with a tall brick chimney that belched black smoke into the sky. Inside, the grinding stones crushed the cane stalks, and the juice flowed into copper kettles heated by roaring fires. The air hung thick with the sickly sweet smell of boiling sugar, mixed with the sweat of bodies pushed beyond their limits. Jacob worked the barrel room, where the finished sugar was stored in massive wooden casks that would be loaded onto riverboats and shipped north to markets in Louisville and Pittsburgh and Cincinnati. Each barrel had to be filled precisely, sealed tight, then rolled into position for storage. The work required strength and careful attention because a dropped barrel could spill hundreds of pounds of valuable sugar across the floor. Jacob performed his duties without complaint, moving through the work with the mechanical precision of someone who had learned to shut off the part of his mind that felt pain or exhaustion or rage. The other enslaved workers knew Jacob as a man who kept to himself. He lived in the 3rd cabin from the end of the quarters, a structure with gaps between the boards that let the winter wind whistle through. At night, when the others sat around fires sharing stories or singing songs that their grandparents had brought from Africa, Jacob stayed inside his cabin. Some said he was reading, though nobody knew where he had learned that forbidden skill. Others claimed they heard him talking to himself in languages that did not sound like any words spoken on the plantation. A few whispered that Jacob knew things, saw things, understood the world in ways that frightened them. Marie Duchamp worked in the big house as a seamstress, her fingers skilled at the delicate work of mending the Beaumont family's expensive clothing. She was 35 years old, born on the plantation, and she had survived by learning to read the white folks' moods the way sailors read the weather. Marie noticed things others missed, the small changes in behavior that signaled danger or opportunity. She had watched Jacob for years, curious about the tall, quiet man who seemed to exist in his own separate reality. One evening in September of 1842, Marie brought Jacob a shirt she had mended for him. The fabric had torn during his work, and she had sewn it back together with neat stitches that made the repair almost invisible. Jacob accepted the shirt with a nod of gratitude, and Marie lingered in the doorway of his cabin, studying the dim interior. She saw books, actual printed books stacked against one wall. This was dangerous contraband that could get a slave whipped or sold if discovered. Marie said nothing about the books, but she did ask Jacob a question that had been on her mind for weeks. "Why do you stay so separate from everyone else? We all carry the same burdens here." Jacob looked at her for a long moment before answering, his voice low and careful. "Some burdens are meant to be carried alone. Some knowledge creates distance whether you want it or not." Marie understood he was telling her something important, though she could not fully grasp what it meant. She left the cabin with more questions than answers, but she also felt a strange certainty that Jacob Ellis was not going to remain on Beaumont Plantation much longer. How she knew this she could not explain, but the feeling settled into her bones with the weight of truth. The grinding season began in early October, and the plantation shifted into its brutal rhythm of constant labor. The enslaved workers cut cane under the burning sun, loaded it onto wagons, fed it into the grinding stones. The mill operated 24 hours each day, with workers rotating through shifts that blurred together into an exhausting cycle. Sleep became something stolen in brief moments, a few hours of unconsciousness before the overseer's horn blasted them awake again. Injuries were common during grinding season. A man named Abraham lost 2 fingers to the grinding stones in the first week. A woman named Rebecca collapsed from exhaustion and died 3 days later, her body simply giving up under the impossible demands. Jacob worked the night shift in the barrel room, stacking the heavy casks as they were filled with processed sugar. He worked alongside 4 other men. Daniel, who had worked barrels for 15 years and knew every trick for moving the heavy loads. Benjamin, a younger man whose strength was legendary on the plantation. Isaac, who sang while he worked, his voice rising above the noise of the mill. And Moses, an older man who moved slowly but never made mistakes. The 5 of them developed a rhythm, a pattern of movement that allowed them to work efficiently despite their exhaustion. They communicated with gestures and brief words, conserving their energy for the physical labor. The barrel room was hot even at night, the heat from the kettles radiating through the walls. Sweat poured down their faces, soaked their clothing, made the wooden handles of tools slippery and dangerous. On the night of October 17th, Jacob arrived at the mill for his shift and immediately sensed something wrong. The air felt different, charged with an energy that made the hair on his arms stand up. The other men felt it too, though they could not articulate what had changed. Daniel mentioned that the barrels felt heavier than usual, as if the wood itself had gained weight. Benjamin complained of a headache, a pressure behind his eyes that would not ease. Isaac stopped singing, his usual cheerfulness replaced by a nervous silence. Jacob moved through his work, but his mind was elsewhere. He had been dreaming lately, vivid visions that came to him in the brief hours he slept. In these dreams, he saw himself walking through the sugarcane fields at night, following paths that did not exist in daylight. He encountered people from his past, his mother and father appearing young and whole, speaking to him in voices that echoed strangely. The dreams always ended the same way, with Jacob standing at the edge of the river watching the dark water flow past while something enormous moved beneath the surface. Around midnight, the overseer left the mill to check on the cane-cutting crews in the distant fields. This left the enslaved workers briefly unsupervised, a rare moment when they could breathe without feeling eyes on them. Daniel stretched his back, groaning at the pain in his muscles. Benjamin sat down on a barrel, wiping sweat from his face. Isaac drank water from a clay jug, the liquid barely cooling his parched throat. Moses stood near the door, looking out at the darkness beyond the mill. "Jacob, you feeling all right?" Moses asked, his weathered face creasing with concern. "You look like you seen a ghost." Jacob did not answer immediately. He was staring at the barrels stacked against the far wall, 20 of them arranged in 4 rows of 5. Something about their positioning bothered him, though he could not explain why. They looked wrong somehow, as if they were waiting for something. The temperature in the barrel room suddenly dropped. All 5 men felt it, a cold that swept through the space despite the heat from the kettles next door. Their breath began to fog in the air, impossible in the Louisiana humidity. Daniel stood up quickly, his eyes wide with fear. Benjamin backed away from the barrels, his legendary strength suddenly useless against the wrongness filling the room. Then the barrels began to move. The first one rolled forward slowly, its wooden sides making a deep rumbling sound against the floor. Then another moved, and another, until all 20 barrels were rolling across the room without anyone touching them. They moved with purpose, arranging themselves in a pattern that made no logical sense. The enslaved workers watched in frozen terror as the barrels formed a circle in the center of the room, each one stopping in precisely the right position to create a perfect geometric shape. "Lord have mercy," Isaac whispered, his voice shaking. "What devilry is this?" Daniel ran for the door, his fear overcoming any concern about punishment for leaving his post. Benjamin followed, then Isaac, their footsteps pounding across the wooden floor. Moses hesitated, looking back at Jacob, who remained standing in the same spot, watching the barrels with an expression that was not quite surprise and not quite recognition. "Jacob, come on!" Moses shouted. "We got to get away from here." But Jacob did not move. He stepped closer to the circle of barrels, his eyes tracking their arrangement. The pattern meant something. He could feel it. This was not random movement, not chaos or destruction. This was a message, a sign written in wood and physics and something beyond the natural world. The air above the barrels began to shimmer like heat rising from sun-baked ground. Jacob saw shapes forming in that shimmer, figures that seemed to exist between visibility and invisibility. They were people, he realized, or the memory of people, or the potential of people not yet born. They moved around the circle, their forms flickering in and out of existence, and Jacob understood with sudden clarity that he was seeing something most people never witnessed, a glimpse into the layers of reality that existed beyond ordinary perception. One of the figures solidified more than the others, becoming clear enough that Jacob could make out features. It was a woman, tall and dignified, with her hair wrapped in colorful cloth. She looked directly at Jacob with eyes that held ancient knowledge, and when she spoke, her voice came from inside his head rather than through his ears. "You have carried the weight long enough, child. Tonight, you choose your path. Stay in chains and die slowly, piece by piece, until nothing remains of who you truly are, or walk through the door that opens only once, that leads to a place beyond their reach. You know what you are. You have always known. Stop hiding from it." Jacob felt tears running down his face, though he was not aware of crying. The woman's words struck something deep inside him, a truth he had been avoiding for years. He did know what he was, had known since he was a child, watching his mother work roots and herbs, speaking words in the old languages their captors could not understand. He had inherited her gifts, her connection to things beyond the physical world, and he had spent his entire adult life trying to suppress those abilities, afraid of what they might mean. The woman smiled at him. And in that smile, Jacob saw compassion and encouragement and a fierce pride. She raised one hand pointing toward the circle of barrels, and Jacob understood that the circle was more than a pattern. It was a doorway, a threshold between one kind of existence and another. Moses had run to the door but stopped there, unable to force himself to abandon Jacob completely. He watched as Jacob walked forward, stepping into the center of the barrel circle. The shimmer intensified, becoming a wall of light that obscured Jacob from view. Moses shouted his name, but his voice seemed to be swallowed by the light, reaching no farther than a few feet from his mouth. The barrels began to spin, rotating around Jacob in a slow circle that gradually increased in speed. The rumbling sound grew louder, deeper, becoming a vibration that shook the entire building. Moses felt the floor trembling beneath his feet, saw dust falling from the rafters overhead. He knew he should run, should get as far from this supernatural event as possible. But he remained frozen in the doorway, unable to look away from the spinning barrels and the light that now filled the entire center of the room. Then, with a sound like thunder rolling across the sky, everything stopped. The barrels sat motionless in their perfect circle. The light vanished, the air returned to its normal humid warmth, and Jacob Ellis was gone, as completely as if he had never existed. Moses stood in the doorway, his mouth open, his mind struggling to process what he had witnessed. He took a tentative step back into the barrel room, then another, approaching the circle of barrels with the caution of someone walking into a lion's den. When he reached the edge of the circle, he looked down and saw nothing. No body, no blood, no sign of struggle or violence. Just empty floor and the barrels sitting in their precise arrangement. The overseer returned 20 minutes later, riding his horse up to the mill with his whip coiled at his side. He found 4 enslaved workers huddled outside the building, refusing to go back in, speaking rapidly about barrels moving on their own and lights and sounds that did not belong to this world. He found Moses standing inside staring at the circle of barrels, and he found no trace of Jacob Ellis anywhere on the plantation grounds. Randolph Beaumont arrived at dawn, roused from his comfortable bed by the overseer's frantic report. He was a man of 40 years, well-fed and satisfied with his place in the world's hierarchy. The supernatural story the enslaved workers told meant nothing to him. Barrels did not move by themselves. Enslaved people did not simply vanish into thin air. There had to be a rational explanation, and that explanation was probably that Jacob had run away, possibly with the help of the other workers who were now covering for him with this absurd tale. "Search every building on the plantation," Beaumont ordered. "Check the fields, the riverbank, every possible hiding place. And if those other 4 workers are lying to protect him, they will learn what happens to those who help runaways." The search continued for 3 days. Men combed through the sugarcane fields, beating the stalks with sticks to flush out anyone hiding within. They searched the slave quarters, tearing through cabins and belongings, looking for any evidence of escape plans. They questioned every enslaved person on the plantation, using intimidation and threats to extract information. They found nothing. Jacob Ellis had disappeared as thoroughly as smoke and wind. Marie heard about Jacob's vanishing while she worked in the big house, listening to the white folks discuss it over breakfast. She felt a strange mixture of fear and something close to joy. She remembered her conversation with Jacob weeks earlier. His words about burdens carried alone and knowledge that created distance. Somehow she was not surprised that he had found a way to slip beyond the plantation's boundaries, though the method of his departure defied all logic and natural law. That afternoon, while the Beaumont family napped through the hottest part of the day, Marie slipped out to the mill. She wanted to see the barrel circle for herself, to stand in the space where Jacob had last been seen. The overseer had ordered the barrels moved back to their normal storage positions, but Marie could still see the marks on the floor where they had sat in their perfect circle. She knelt down, running her fingers over the wood, and felt a warmth that seemed to come from below the surface. As she crouched there, Marie heard footsteps behind her. She turned quickly, ready to explain her presence, and found herself facing an elderly enslaved man named Josiah. He was 70 years old if he was a day, his hair white as cotton, his body bent from decades of labor. Josiah rarely spoke to anyone, spending his days caring for the plantation's chickens, a relatively easy job given to him in recognition of his age. "You feel it too," Josiah said, his voice surprisingly strong for someone so old. The place where the door opened. Marie stared at him, uncertain how to respond. Josiah shuffled closer, his eyes studying the marks on the floor with the intensity of someone reading a book. "I seen this before, long time back," Josiah continued. "Different plantation, different person, but the same kind of event. There are some among us who carry the old knowledge, the gifts our ancestors brought across the ocean. Most of the time, those gifts stay hidden, buried under the weight of bondage and fear. But sometimes, when the pressure becomes too great, when a person reaches the edge of what they can endure, those gifts break through. They create possibilities that should not exist according to the white folks' understanding of the world." Marie listened, her heart beating fast. "Are you saying Jacob was special? That he had some kind of power?" Josiah smiled, revealing a few remaining teeth. Jacob was one of the aware ones, a person who understood that reality is thinner than most people think. He learned to see the spaces between things, the places where our world touches other realms. And when the moment came when he could no longer bear to remain in chains, he found a way through. The barrels moving on their own, that was not magic in the fairy tale sense. That was concentrated will, focused intention, breaking through the barriers between possible and impossible. Marie wanted to believe this explanation, wanted to think that Jacob had truly escaped to somewhere beyond Beaumont's reach. But doubt crept into her thoughts. Maybe Jacob had simply run away in the confusion, and the supernatural story was a distraction. Maybe he was hiding somewhere close by, waiting for a chance to move farther north. "You do not believe," Josiah said, reading her expression. "I understand. Belief requires trust in things unseen, and we have learned not to trust anything we cannot touch with our hands. But I will tell you this. I have lived 70 years, seen things that would break your mind if I described them. I know the difference between a runaway and a departure. Jacob Ellis departed in the truest sense of the word. He stepped out of this version of existence and into another. Whether he is alive or dead by our definitions, I cannot say. But he is beyond the masters now, beyond their whips and chains and power." Josiah turned and walked away, leaving Marie alone with her thoughts and the marks on the floor. She stayed there for a while longer, trying to make sense of everything before returning to the big house and her duties. The story of Jacob's vanishing spread beyond Beaumont Plantation, carried by enslaved people who worked as boatmen on the river, by those hired out to neighboring plantations, by anyone who heard the tale and found it worth repeating. Each telling added new details, embellishments that grew in the fertile soil of hope and desperation. Some versions claimed Jacob had turned into a bird and flown away. Others said he had walked into the river and transformed into a fish, swimming north to freedom. A few insisted he had been taken up to heaven by angels, his suffering finally at an end. The white plantation owners heard these stories and dismissed them as the foolish superstitions of an ignorant people. They increased patrols along the river, tightened restrictions on enslaved people's movements, posted larger rewards for captured runaways. They told themselves that Jacob Ellis was hiding somewhere, probably in the swamps or the forests, and would eventually be caught and returned or killed trying to escape. But among the enslaved population, Jacob's disappearance became something more significant than one man's escape. It became a symbol of possibility, a reminder that the system of bondage that seemed so permanent and inescapable might have weaknesses invisible to those in power. The story gave people something to hold on to during the darkest moments, a small flame of hope in the suffocating darkness. Back at Beaumont Plantation, life continued with its brutal routine. The grinding season pushed forward, demanding every ounce of strength the enslaved workers possessed. Randolph Beaumont replaced Jacob with another enslaved man, someone younger and stronger, and expected the work to continue without interruption. The barrel room operated as it always had, though the workers assigned there reported strange feelings at night, sensations of being watched by invisible eyes, sounds that had no source. Daniel, who had been first to run from the barrel room that night, never spoke of what he had witnessed. When questioned by other enslaved people, he simply shook his head and changed the subject. The memory haunted him, invading his dreams, making him jump at unexpected sounds. He had seen something that challenged everything he understood about the world, and his mind could not fully accept it. Benjamin tried to explain what happened to his wife, a woman named Clara who worked in the fields. He described the barrels moving on their own, the cold air, the light surrounding Jacob. Clara listened without interrupting, then said something that stayed with Benjamin for years. Maybe some people are meant to break the rules everyone else has to follow. Maybe that is how change begins, one impossible thing at a time. Isaac incorporated the story into his songs, creating verses about a man who walked through walls of wood and disappeared into light. He sang these verses quietly, careful not to let the overseers hear, and other enslaved people picked up the melody, carrying it across the plantation and beyond. Moses never told anyone the full truth of what he had witnessed. He kept the memory of that night locked inside, turning it over in his mind during the long hours of labor. He thought about the woman who had appeared in the shimmer above the barrels, the figure that seemed to speak directly to Jacob. He wondered if he had actually seen her, or if fear and exhaustion had created a hallucination. Either way, the memory remained vivid, refusing to fade despite the passing weeks. Winter arrived, bringing cold rains that turned the dirt paths into mud. The grinding season ended in January, and the pace of work slowed to something almost bearable. The enslaved workers caught up on sleep, repaired their worn clothing, tried to recover from the brutal months of constant labor. The mill sat silent, the grinding stones still, the kettles cold, waiting for the next October when the whole exhausting cycle would begin again. Marie continued working in the big house, her needle and thread creating perfect stitches in expensive fabric. She thought about Jacob often, wondering where he was, if he was safe, if Josiah had been right about him stepping into another realm of existence. She had gone back to Jacob's cabin once after his disappearance, slipping inside when no one was watching. The books were gone, removed by someone, possibly the overseer, searching for evidence. The space felt empty, abandoned, holding no trace of the man who had lived there. Spring came with its explosion of green, the sugarcane growing tall in the rich soil. Beaumont Plantation continued its operations, profitable and efficient by the standards of the time. Randolph Beaumont never spoke of Jacob Ellis after the first week of searching, dismissing the entire incident as a minor inconvenience in the business of running a plantation. He had lost enslaved workers before through death or escape, and he would lose more in the future. Such was the nature of the institution he participated in without moral questioning. But the story did not die. It lived in the memories of those who had witnessed the events of that October night, and in the retellings that spread across Louisiana and beyond. It became part of the oral tradition, passed down through generations, altered and shaped by the needs of those who told it. Some versions maintained the supernatural elements, presenting Jacob as a man with special powers who transcended the physical limitations of slavery. Other versions made him simply a clever runaway who used misdirection and confusion to cover his escape. Years passed. The 1840s gave way to the 1850s, and tensions over slavery intensified across the nation. The arguments that had simmered for decades reached a boiling point, and people on both sides knew that some kind of reckoning was approaching. In the slave quarters of plantations across the South, people whispered about change coming, about a future when the chains would finally break. The story of Jacob Ellis often appeared in these whispered conversations, an example of liberation achieved through means the masters could not control or prevent. Daniel died in 1853, his body giving out after decades of brutal labor. On his deathbed, surrounded by his family, he finally spoke about what he had seen in the barrel room that October night. He described the barrels moving in impossible ways, the cold air, the light that swallowed Jacob whole. He told them that in his final moment of life he wanted them to know the truth. He had witnessed something miraculous, something that proved the masters did not have complete power over them. There were forces in the world beyond their understanding, and sometimes those forces sided with the enslaved rather than the enslavers. Benjamin lived longer, surviving until after the Civil War ended and emancipation came. In his old age, he would sit outside his small house and tell anyone who would listen about the night Jacob Ellis vanished. By then, the story had taken on the polish of myth, the details smoothed and shaped by countless retellings. But the core remained. A man in chains had found a way to freedom through means that defied natural law, and in doing so had given hope to thousands of others who heard his story. Isaac's song spread far beyond Beaumont Plantation. Other enslaved people learned the melodies and lyrics, adapting them to their own situations, adding verses about their own losses and hopes and dreams of freedom. After emancipation, some of these songs were collected by scholars studying African American music, and the verses about the man who disappeared in light were recorded for future generations. The name Jacob Ellis appeared in these collections, preserved in print, ensuring that even if the man himself was lost to history, the story of his vanishing would endure. Moses lived until 1868, dying peacefully in his sleep at the age of 61. In the years after emancipation, he became known as a storyteller, someone who kept the memories of slavery alive so that future generations would understand what their ancestors had endured. He told many stories, but none captured people's imagination like the tale of Jacob Ellis and the barrels that moved on their own. Moses always ended the story the same way, with a question. Did Jacob escape through human means, slipping away in the confusion and making his way north through cunning and courage? Or did something beyond our understanding intervene, opening a door that should not have existed, allowing a suffering man to step into a realm beyond the master's reach? The answer, Moses would say, matters less than the fact that the question can be asked at all. Marie survived into the early 1870s, living long enough to see her grandchildren born into freedom. She never forgot Jacob Ellis, the quiet man who kept books hidden in his cabin and seemed to exist in his own separate reality. In her final years, when her eyesight had failed and her hands could no longer hold a needle and thread, she would sometimes tell her grandchildren about him. She would describe the way he moved, deliberate and purposeful, as if every action was part of some larger plan invisible to others. She would speak of the marks on the mill floor where the barrels had sat in their perfect circle, marks that remained visible for years until the building was torn down. and she would tell them that she believed, truly believed, that Jacob had found a way out that no one else could follow, a path that opened only for him because he possessed knowledge and abilities beyond ordinary human understanding. The Beaumont plantation continued operating until the Civil War disrupted the Southern economy. Randolph Beaumont died in 1864, never living to see the Confederate defeat or the end of slavery. His children tried to maintain the plantation after the war, hiring formerly enslaved people as wage laborers, but the economic model no longer functioned. By 1875, the property had been sold and divided, the big house abandoned, the sugar mill demolished for its materials. The land returned to agricultural use, but the enormous wealth and power the Beaumont family had wielded disappeared, swept away by the tides of history. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, folklorists and historians began collecting stories from formerly enslaved people, trying to preserve their experiences and traditions before the generation that had lived through slavery died out. The story of Jacob Ellis appeared in several of these collections, usually presented as an example of supernatural folklore from the slavery era. Academic scholars debated whether such stories represented actual beliefs or were simply entertaining tales told to pass the time. Most concluded they were the latter, dismissing the supernatural elements as fantasy. But among African American communities in Louisiana and beyond, the story maintained its power. It appeared in church sermons as an allegory for spiritual transcendence. It showed up in literature, inspiring poems and novels about the search for freedom and the power of faith. It became part of the cultural heritage, a story that connected people to their ancestors and reminded them of the strength and resilience that had allowed their people to survive centuries of oppression. In the mid-20th century, during the Civil Rights Movement, the story of Jacob Ellis experienced a resurgence. Activists looking for historical examples of resistance to oppression found inspiration in tales of enslaved people who had refused to accept their bondage, who had found ways to resist through both practical and spiritual means. The mysterious circumstances of Jacob's disappearance became less important than what he represented. An individual who had rejected the definitions and limitations imposed upon him by an unjust system. Historians researching Louisiana plantation records in the 1960s and 70s found scattered mentions of Jacob Ellis in the Beaumont family papers, now preserved in university archives. There were receipts from his purchase in 1830, entries in account books recording his assignment to various work duties, and a brief notation about his disappearance in October of 1842. The official record listed him as a runaway, with a reward of $100 offered for his capture and return. There was no mention of barrels moving on their own or supernatural lights or anything beyond a simple escape. Yet the lack of official documentation for the miraculous elements of the story did not diminish its cultural significance. The tale had taken on a life of its own, existing in the realm of collective memory and shared tradition rather than written history. It belonged to the people who told it and retold it, who found meaning in its mystery and hope in its suggestion that the impossible might sometimes become possible. In the early 21st century, a descendant of Moses, a woman named Jennifer Washington, became interested in her family history and began researching her ancestors. She found Moses in census records and in collections of formerly enslaved people's narratives. She discovered his stories about Jacob Ellis and became fascinated by the tale. Jennifer visited the site of the former Beaumont plantation, now partially covered by suburban development and partially returned to forest. She walked the land where her great-great-great-grandfather had labored, trying to imagine the world he had known. At the place where the sugar mill had once stood, now just an empty field with a few foundation stones visible beneath the grass, Jennifer felt a strange sensation. The air seemed charged with energy, vibrating with frequencies she could not quite perceive but somehow sensed. She stood there for a long time thinking about Jacob Ellis and his mysterious disappearance, about the enslaved workers who had witnessed something they could not explain, about the way stories survive across generations when they touch something essential in the human spirit. Jennifer wrote a book about her research, published by a small press specializing in African American history. In the book, she presented multiple interpretations of Jacob Ellis's vanishing, the rational explanation that he had escaped in the confusion and made his way north, possibly with help from the Underground Railroad. The supernatural explanation that he had possessed abilities beyond normal human understanding and had used them to transcend the physical barriers of slavery. And a third possibility, one that Jennifer found most compelling, that the truth contained elements of both rational and supernatural, that Jacob had been a real man with practical knowledge who had also understood spiritual forces his captors dismissed as superstition, and that he had used both kinds of knowledge to achieve his freedom. The book found a modest audience, mostly among academics and people interested in African American folklore. But the story it told continued spreading, carried now by the internet and social media, reaching people around the world who found inspiration in the tale of a man who refused to accept his chains. Today, the story of Jacob Ellis exists in multiple forms and versions. It appears in academic papers analyzing supernatural folklore of the American South. It shows up in novels and films that dramatize the experiences of enslaved people. It is told in classrooms teaching the history of slavery and resistance. It lives in the memories of descendants of enslaved people, passed down through family stories and traditions. And it continues evolving, each new generation adding its own interpretations and meanings to the core narrative. The truth of what happened to Jacob Ellis in that sugar mill on an October night in 1842 remains unknowable. Did he escape through human courage and ingenuity, slipping away in the chaos and confusion? Did he die somewhere in the wilderness, his body never found, becoming another anonymous casualty of slavery's brutality? Or did something truly extraordinary occur, a moment when the normal rules of reality bent or broke, allowing a suffering man to step through a doorway into somewhere beyond? Perhaps the question itself misses the point. The power of Jacob's story lies not in determining its factual accuracy, but in what it reveals about the human need for hope and transcendence in the face of overwhelming oppression. The enslaved people who first told this story needed to believe that their bondage was not absolute, that there were forces in the universe their masters could not control, that freedom might come through unexpected means. Their descendants needed similar reassurance, that the injustices they faced were not permanent and inevitable, that change was possible even when it seemed impossible. The story of Jacob Ellis and the barrels that moved on their own reminds us that history is more than dates and documents, that the full truth of the past includes the stories people told themselves to survive, the myths and legends that carried their hopes and dreams. It reminds us that sometimes the most important truths cannot be proven through evidence and logic, but must be felt and believed and passed on through the generations. In Louisiana today, if you visit the area where Beaumont Plantation once stood, you will find no historical markers commemorating Jacob Ellis. There are no monuments or museums preserving his story. The sugarcane fields have been replaced by other uses, the plantation house long since demolished, the slave quarters vanished without a trace. But the story endures, living in books and articles and conversations, in the memories of those who claim descent from the people who knew him, in the oral traditions that refuse to die, no matter how much time passes. And on certain October nights, when the humidity hangs thick in the air and the darkness seems especially deep, some people claim they can still feel something strange in the place where the sugar mill once stood. They describe a charge in the atmosphere, a sense of boundaries thinning, as if that long-ago moment of impossible transformation left a permanent mark on reality itself. They say if you stand very still and listen carefully, you might hear the rumble of wooden barrels rolling across a floor that no longer exists, moving in patterns that defy gravity and logic, circling around a space where a man once chose freedom over bondage through means that nobody can fully explain. Whether you believe these claims or dismiss them as imagination and wishful thinking, the fact remains that Jacob Ellis's story continues to resonate more than 180 years after his disappearance. It speaks to something fundamental in the human experience: the yearning for liberation, the refusal to accept injustice as permanent, the faith that sometimes, against all odds and rational expectations, the impossible becomes possible. The barrels rolled on their own that October night, and Jacob Ellis vanished into mystery. Whether he found freedom in the North, whether he died in the attempt, whether he stepped through some supernatural doorway into a realm beyond our understanding, we cannot know with certainty. But we can know this: his story gave hope to people who desperately needed it, and it continues to inspire those who hear it today. That is the real miracle, not the moving barrels or the mysterious lights, but the enduring power of one person's refusal to remain bound, and the way that refusal echoes across the centuries, reminding us all that human dignity and the desire for freedom cannot be completely suppressed by any system of oppression. Jacob Ellis lived, he suffered, he resisted, and he departed from bondage through whatever means were available to him. His story belongs to everyone who has ever felt trapped by circumstances beyond their control. Everyone who has ever dreamed of breaking free from chains both visible and invisible. Everyone who has ever believed that the world contains more possibilities than what we can see and touch and prove. It is a story about the limits of power and the unlimited nature of hope, about the ways people survive terrible circumstances by creating and sharing narratives that allow them to imagine different futures. The sugar mill is gone. The plantation has vanished. The people who witnessed Jacob's disappearance are long dead, but the story remains, living and breathing, changing and growing, refusing to be silenced or forgotten. That persistence, that refusal to die, may be the greatest evidence that something extraordinary happened on that October night in 1842. Something that touched the lives of everyone who heard about it, and continues touching lives today. The barrels rolled on their own, and a man walked into light and disappeared, and the memory of that impossible moment carries forward through time, reminding us that sometimes, just sometimes, the walls that seem so solid and permanent turn out to be less substantial than we think, and freedom finds a way even when every logical path is blocked. That is the story of Jacob Ellis, the enslaved man who vanished from Beaumont Plantation when the sugar barrels rolled into their perfect circle, and the ordinary laws of reality bent just enough to let one's suffering soul slip through into mystery. Whether you believe it happened as told, or whether you interpret it as metaphor and symbol, the core truth remains unchanged. Jacob refused to accept his bondage, and one way or another he broke free. His courage, real or legendary, practical or supernatural, lives on in every person who hears his name and wonders what really happened on that long-ago October night when the impossible briefly became possible, and one man seized his chance to step beyond the reach of those who claim to own him. The end came for slavery in America, though Jacob did not live to see it in the conventional sense. The institution that seemed so permanent and unshakable crumbled and fell, destroyed by war and moral awakening and the relentless pressure of those who refused to accept it as natural or inevitable. The masters lost their power, the enslaved became free, and a new world emerged from the ashes of the old. In that new world, Jacob Ellis's story took on additional meaning. becoming not just a tale of one man's escape but a parable about the larger liberation that eventually came to all his people. Today, when people tell the story of Jacob Ellis and the barrels that moved on their own, they are doing more than recounting historical events or sharing folklore. They are keeping alive a connection to ancestors who survived unimaginable hardships, honoring the creativity and resilience that allowed enslaved people to maintain their humanity and hope in the face of systematic dehumanization. They are asserting that the official historical record, with its focus on the powerful and prominent, does not capture the full truth of the past. They are claiming space for the stories of ordinary people who did extraordinary things, whose lives mattered then and matter now, whose struggles and triumphs deserve to be remembered and honored. The mystery of Jacob Ellis's fate may never be definitively solved, and perhaps that is appropriate. Some questions are more valuable for being asked than answered. Some mysteries more powerful for remaining mysterious. Jacob walked into light and vanished, and in vanishing became immortal. His story living forever in the imagination and memory of people who need to believe that freedom is always possible. That oppression never has the final word, that the human spirit possesses resources beyond what tyrants can comprehend or control. The barrels rolled, Jacob disappeared, and the story goes on, carrying forward the essential message that those 20 wooden casks spelled out in their impossible circle on that October night in 1842. That bondage is not destiny, that walls can be transcended, that sometimes the universe itself conspires to help those who refuse to accept injustice, and that the power of one person's courage can ripple across centuries, inspiring countless others to believe in possibilities beyond what seems rational or achievable. That is Jacob Ellis's legacy, and it endures as long as his story continues to be told. The months following Jacob's disappearance brought changes to Beaumont Plantation that nobody could have predicted. The first sign appeared 3 weeks after that October night, when the new worker assigned to replace Jacob in the barrel room refused to enter the building after sunset. The man, whose name was Cornelius, had worked plantations his entire life and considered himself practical and unshakable. But something about the barrel room unsettled him in ways he could not articulate. He told the overseer that the air felt wrong in there, that shadows moved independently of light sources, that he heard whispers in languages he did not recognize. The overseer responded with predictable brutality, using his whip to enforce compliance. Cornelius worked the barrel room for 2 nights under threat of worse punishment. But on the 3rd night he collapsed during his shift, his body seizing with convulsions that the plantation's makeshift medical care could not explain or treat. He died 3 days later, his final words a warning to stay away from the place where the barrels had moved. The enslaved community took notice. They had seen people die from exhaustion, from injuries, from diseases, but Cornelius had been healthy and strong. His death felt connected to Jacob's vanishing, another piece of evidence that something unnatural had occurred in that building. Randolph Beaumont, faced with the growing reluctance of enslaved workers to enter the barrel room at night, made a decision that reflected both his practical nature and his complete dismissal of supernatural explanations. He had the barrel room operations moved to a different building, a newer structure on the opposite side of the mill. The old barrel room was converted to general storage, used only during daylight hours. Beaumont told himself this was simply efficient management, relocating operations to a better facility. But the enslaved workers understood the deeper truth. Even the master, who claimed absolute authority, could not force people to work in a place that had been marked by forces beyond his control. Marie watched these developments with keen interest. She had returned to Jacob's abandoned cabin several times, drawn by something she could not name. The space remained empty, stripped of the few possessions Jacob had accumulated. But Marie noticed details that others missed. scratch marks on the wooden floor that formed patterns resembling the circle the barrels had created. Stains on the walls that appeared to shift in color depending on the angle of light. A persistent smell of something neither pleasant nor unpleasant but distinctly other, as if the cabin existed partially in a different atmosphere than the rest of the plantation. One evening in December, as winter settled over Louisiana with its damp cold, Marie sat in Jacob's former cabin and spoke aloud to the empty space. She did not know if anyone or anything could hear her, but the words came anyway, pulled from some deep need to communicate with whatever remained of the man who had vanished. She told the empty room about the changes on the plantation, about Cornelius's death, about the way people spoke Jacob's name now, with a mixture of fear and reverence. She described how the story had spread beyond Beaumont Plantation, how enslaved people on neighboring properties asked questions about what really happened, how even some white folks had started paying attention to the tale. As Marie spoke, the temperature in the cabin dropped noticeably. Her breath formed clouds in the air, and she felt the same sensation she had experienced in the mill's barrel room. That sense of boundaries thinning, of multiple realities pressing against each other. For a moment, just a fleeting instant, she thought she saw a figure standing in the corner of the cabin. Tall, familiar in posture, with eyes that looked through the present moment into distances beyond sight. Then the moment passed, the temperature returned to normal, and Marie was alone again with only the certainty that something had acknowledged her presence. The grinding season of 1843 began with unusual weather patterns. Rain fell when it should have been dry, temperatures fluctuated wildly, and the sugarcane grew in irregular patterns that puzzled even experienced planters. Randolph Beaumont attributed these anomalies to natural variation, the unpredictable nature of agriculture. But among the enslaved workers, a different interpretation took hold. They believed the land itself had been affected by Jacob's departure, that his passage through the supernatural doorway had created ripples that continued disturbing the normal order of things. Benjamin, the strong young man who had witnessed the barrels moving, found himself unable to forget what he had seen. The memory invaded his waking thoughts and dominated his dreams. He began seeking out older enslaved people, those who had lived long enough to accumulate knowledge about things beyond the everyday world. He spoke with root workers and conjure women, with elderly men who had been born in Africa and remembered traditions from before the Middle Passage. From these conversations, Benjamin pieced together an understanding of the world that the white masters dismissed as primitive superstition, but which contained sophisticated philosophical and spiritual concepts. One of the people Benjamin consulted was an ancient woman named Abeni, who lived on a neighboring plantation but was sometimes hired out for her skills in healing. Abeni was said to be over 90 years old, though nobody knew for certain. She had been captured in what is now Nigeria as a young woman and had survived the horrific voyage across the Atlantic. Despite decades of enslavement, she maintained her connection to the spiritual practices of her homeland, adapting them to the new world while preserving their essential power. When Benjamin described what he had witnessed in the barrel room, Abeni listened without interruption, her rheumy eyes fixed on his face. When he finished, she nodded slowly and spoke in accented English mixed with words from her native language. She told him that some people carried what she called double sight, the ability to perceive layers of reality invisible to most. These individuals often lived difficult lives because they could not easily ignore the suffering around them, feeling it more intensely than others. When such a person reached their breaking point, when the weight of accumulated pain became unbearable, they sometimes accessed powers that allowed them to reshape reality according to their will. Jacob was such a person, Abeni said. I never met him, but I recognize his signature in your story. He carried the gift of his ancestors, whether he wanted it or not. And when the moment came, when he could no longer remain in chains without losing himself completely, the gift activated. The barrels moving was not his doing consciously. It was the universe responding to his desperate need, creating the doorway he required. Where that doorway led, I cannot say with certainty. Perhaps to death, perhaps to freedom in the physical sense, perhaps to a place between worlds where the old spirits dwell. But I can tell you this: his departure was no accident or trick. It was a genuine crossing, a transition from one state of being to another. Benjamin carried Abeni's words back to Beaumont Plantation, sharing them with Clara and a few other trusted people. The interpretation spread through the enslaved community, becoming woven into the larger story of Jacob's vanishing. It provided a framework for understanding the supernatural elements, grounding them in a spiritual tradition that predated slavery and connected them to ancestral knowledge from Africa. As years passed and the 1840s progressed toward the 1850s, the story of Jacob Ellis evolved in fascinating ways. New details appeared in various tellings, embellishments that served specific purposes in different contexts. In some versions, Jacob had predicted his own departure, telling other enslaved people that he would soon be leaving, but not in any conventional manner. In other versions, he left behind a message, words scratched into the floor of his cabin that revealed hidden knowledge about paths to freedom. A few stories claim that Jacob had been visited by spirits in the weeks before his vanishing, that these spirits had taught him secrets that enabled his escape. The truth behind these embellishments was impossible to verify, but that did not diminish their power. Each variation of the story served the needs of the people telling it, providing hope or warning or comfort depending on the circumstances. The tale became a living thing, adapting to new contexts, absorbing new meanings, remaining relevant across changing times. In 1850, a formerly enslaved man named Frederick, who had purchased his freedom through years of saving money earned from hiring himself out, visited Beaumont Plantation on business related to barrel making. Frederick had heard various versions of Jacob Ellis's story and was curious to see the place where the mysterious events had occurred. He managed to enter the old barrel room during his visit, standing in the space where the barrels had formed their perfect circle. Frederick later wrote about this experience in a letter to a friend, describing sensations he could not adequately capture in words. He felt, he wrote, as if he stood at the intersection of multiple paths, as if the room existed simultaneously in different times. He heard sounds that had no source, saw lights that cast no shadows, and experienced a profound sense of presence, as if he were being observed by entities neither living nor dead, but existing in some liminal state between. Frederick's letter eventually found its way into the hands of abolitionists in the North, who saw in Jacob Ellis's story a powerful symbol for their cause. They published accounts of his disappearance in their newspapers and pamphlets, often framing it as evidence of divine intervention against slavery. God himself, these accounts suggested, sometimes directly intervened to free his suffering children, and the supernatural circumstances of Jacob's vanishing proved that slavery violated natural and spiritual laws. This interpretation served the abolitionist movement's purposes, though it also simplified and distorted the original story in ways that removed some of its complexity and ambiguity. Back on Beaumont Plantation, Isaac continued singing songs about Jacob's disappearance, but his voice carried a different quality now. The initial fear had transformed into something closer to celebration, a recognition that Jacob had achieved something remarkable, whether through natural or supernatural means. Isaac's song spoke of doors opening in impossible places, of light breaking through darkness, of chains falling away when courage met opportunity. Other enslaved people learned these songs and carried them to different plantations, creating a network of shared musical knowledge that helped maintain community and hope across the separated and isolated enslaved population. Marie had stopped visiting Jacob's abandoned cabin by 1852, but she never forgot the experiences she had there. She had married a man named Joshua, a skilled blacksmith who worked on the plantation, and they had 3 children together. Marie told her children about Jacob Ellis, presenting him as an example of someone who refused to accept the limitations others tried to impose. She did not emphasize the supernatural elements, though she did not deny them either. Instead, she focused on Jacob's quiet determination, his self-education through forbidden books, his ability to maintain an inner life that the masters could not touch or control. One of Marie's daughters, a girl named Sarah, showed an unusual interest in the story. She asked detailed questions about Jacob, wanting to know what he looked like, how he spoke, what books he read. Sarah had inherited her mother's observant nature and her father's analytical mind, and she approached the story of Jacob's vanishing as a puzzle to be understood rather than simply a tale to be passively received. When Sarah was 12 years old, she asked her mother a question that Marie had never directly considered. If Jacob did escape through supernatural means, if he really did step through a doorway into another realm, does that mean such doorways exist everywhere, waiting for people who know how to find them? Marie did not have an answer, but the question stayed with her. It suggested possibilities she had not fully contemplated, implications that extended far beyond one man's mysterious disappearance. If reality was more flexible than it appeared, if determined individuals could sometimes bend or break the rules that seemed absolute, then perhaps the entire system of slavery was more vulnerable than anyone realized. The masters maintained their power through the belief that their authority was natural and unchallengeable. But what if that belief was simply one more lie in a structure built entirely on lies? The Civil War arrived in 1861 and everything changed. The plantation system that had seemed so permanent began crumbling under the pressure of military conflict and economic disruption. Enslaved people fled toward Union lines when opportunities arose, seeking the freedom that had been promised by the advancing armies. Others remained on plantations, waiting to see how events would unfold, navigating the dangerous uncertainties of a world in transition. Randolph Beaumont had died by then, and his sons struggled to maintain control of the plantation with an increasingly unwilling labor force and a collapsing economy. Daniel's children, grown men and women by the time the war began, remembered their father's stories about the night the barrels moved. They interpreted the Union Army's advance as a kind of collective version of what Jacob Ellis had achieved individually, a massive force pushing through barriers that had seemed impenetrable, opening doors that had been locked for generations. The connection between personal and political liberation became clearer during these years, as individual acts of resistance and escape joined with larger historical movements to dismantle slavery. When emancipation finally came, bringing the legal end to slavery, the formerly enslaved people of Beaumont Plantation gathered to celebrate their new status as free individuals. Among the many topics discussed during those early days of freedom was the story of Jacob Ellis. Benjamin, now an older man with white in his hair, stood before a crowd and retold the story of that October night in 1842. He spoke of barrels moving without hands touching them, of cold air and shimmering light, of a man walking into mystery and disappearing completely. He told them that Jacob had been the first among them to achieve freedom, that he had found a way out when no conventional path existed, and that his courage had helped sustain hope through the darkest years. The crowd listened in silence, many of them hearing the story for the first time, others hearing familiar details rendered new by the changed context. After Benjamin finished speaking, an old woman stood up. She had worked in the big house during the slavery years and had overheard many conversations between white folks discussing the plantation's operations and problems. She revealed something she had never mentioned before. In the months after Jacob's disappearance, she had heard Randolph Beaumont admit to his wife that the incident frightened him. He had tried to maintain his rational explanations, his insistence that Jacob had simply run away. But in private moments, he confessed that something about the event disturbed him deeply, that it suggested the existence of forces beyond his control or understanding. This revelation added another dimension to the story. It confirmed that even the masters, with all their power and certainty, had been shaken by Jacob's vanishing. They had felt their authority challenged not just by a runaway slave, but by something more fundamental, a demonstration that their worldview was incomplete, that reality contained possibilities they had never acknowledged. For the formerly enslaved people hearing this revelation, it validated their own interpretations and reinforced the story's significance as a symbol of resistance and transcendence. As the 1870s and 80s progressed, as the formerly enslaved people and their children built new lives in freedom, the story of Jacob Ellis took on additional meanings. It became part of family histories passed down through generations with the same care as names and birth dates. It appeared in the sermons of black preachers who used it to illustrate theological points about faith, divine intervention, and the ultimate triumph of justice. It inspired artistic expressions, from quilts that depicted barrel circles to musical compositions that tried to capture the strange beauty of that October night. Moses's grandchildren grew up hearing the story directly from the man who had witnessed it. They listened with wide eyes as their grandfather described standing in the doorway of the barrel room, watching Jacob walk into the center of that perfect circle, seeing the light envelope him until he vanished. Moses always ended his tellings with the same statement: "I do not know where Jacob went, but I know he is not in chains anymore, and that knowledge kept me going through the hardest times." Whatever happened in that room, whether it was miracle or mystery or something beyond our words to describe, it proved that our masters did not have the final say over our destinies. One of Moses's grandsons became a teacher after the war, opening a small school for black children in a church building near where Beaumont Plantation had stood. He incorporated Jacob Ellis's story into his lessons about history and courage, using it to show his students that their ancestors had been resourceful and strong, that they had found ways to resist oppression even under the most terrible circumstances. The students absorbed these lessons, carrying them forward into their own lives and eventually passing them to their children. The turn of the century brought new challenges and new forms of oppression to black communities in Louisiana and across the South. The brief period of Reconstruction ended, replaced by Jim Crow laws that enforced segregation and disenfranchisement. Violence against black people increased, lynchings became common tools of terror, and many of the gains made after slavery were systematically rolled back. In this context, the story of Jacob Ellis provided a different kind of comfort. It reminded people that their ancestors had survived worse, that resistance took many forms, that hope could persist even when circumstances seemed hopeless. A black newspaper in New Orleans published a version of Jacob's story in 1902, presenting it as an example of the supernatural folklore that enriched African American culture. The article included interviews with several elderly people who claimed connections to the original events, either as witnesses or as children of witnesses. These accounts varied in details but agreed on the essential elements. A man named Jacob Ellis had vanished mysteriously from a sugar plantation near Baton Rouge in 1842, and his disappearance had involved unexplained movement of heavy barrels and reports of unusual lights and sounds. The publication of this article brought the story to a wider audience, including academics at universities who were beginning to study African American culture and folklore with serious scholarly attention. Several researchers visited Louisiana to investigate the story, interviewing descendants of enslaved people from Beaumont Plantation and examining what few records still existed. They found enough documentation to confirm that someone named Jacob Ellis had indeed been enslaved on the plantation and had disappeared in October of 1842, though the supernatural elements remained unverifiable by academic standards. During the 1920s and 30s, the story appeared in collections of Southern folklore and ghost stories, often presented alongside other tales of mysterious disappearances and supernatural events. These collections reached audiences well beyond black communities, introducing Jacob Ellis to white readers who might not otherwise have encountered his story. The cross-cultural transmission sometimes distorted the original meanings, removing the story from its context of slavery and resistance, but it also ensured the tale's survival and continued relevance. Sarah, Marie's daughter, who had asked the perceptive question about doorways existing everywhere, lived until 1938. In her final years, she became known as a keeper of stories, someone who preserved the history of slavery and emancipation for younger generations who had not experienced those times. She told the story of Jacob Ellis hundreds of times, always emphasizing the importance of maintaining hope and believing in possibilities beyond what seemed rational. Sarah never claimed to know exactly what happened to Jacob, but she insisted that his story mattered precisely because it resisted simple explanations, because it challenged listeners to expand their understanding of what was possible. The Great Depression brought economic hardship that affected black communities with particular severity. During these difficult years, the story of Jacob Ellis provided spiritual sustenance to people struggling with poverty and discrimination. It reminded them that their ancestors had faced even worse circumstances and had found ways to survive with dignity and creativity. The tale suggested that even in the darkest times, even when all conventional paths seemed blocked, new possibilities might emerge for those who maintained courage and vision. World War II disrupted American society in profound ways, including accelerating the great migration of black people from the rural South to northern and western cities. Many descendants of enslaved people from Louisiana plantations relocated to places like Chicago, Detroit, Los Angeles, and New York, carrying their family stories with them. The tale of Jacob Ellis traveled north and west with these migrations, adapting to new urban contexts while retaining its essential elements. In city apartments and factory break rooms, people told the story of the man who had vanished when barrels moved on their own, using it to maintain connections to Southern roots and to remember the struggles their ancestors had overcome. The civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s created new context for understanding stories of resistance from the slavery era. Activists looking for historical inspiration found it in tales like Jacob Ellis's Vanishing, which demonstrated that enslaved people had never passively accepted their bondage but had resisted in countless ways, both practical and spiritual. The story appeared in speeches and writings by civil rights leaders, usually presented as an allegory for the kind of transformative change the movement sought to achieve. Just as Jacob had broken through impossible barriers, the movement aimed to break through the barriers of segregation and discrimination that seemed equally impossible to overcome. A young historian named Marcus Williams, descended from Benjamin through several generations, wrote his doctoral dissertation in 1967 about supernatural folklore in African American culture during slavery. He devoted an entire chapter to Jacob Ellis's story, analyzing its evolution across more than a century and exploring how different communities had interpreted and used the tale for various purposes. Marcus's research took him to archives across Louisiana and beyond, piecing together fragments of documentation and oral testimony to create the most comprehensive account of the story yet assembled. What Marcus discovered in his research fascinated him. He found that the story had never been static, never remained locked in a single version. Instead, it had continuously evolved, each generation adding new elements while preserving core themes. Some versions emphasize the supernatural aspects, presenting Jacob as someone with genuine magical powers. Others downplayed those elements, focusing on Jacob as a clever man who used confusion and misdirection to cover a conventional escape. A few versions incorporated Christian themes, interpreting the event as divine intervention. Others connected it to African spiritual traditions, presenting it as an example of ancestral powers manifesting to protect their descendants. Marcus concluded that this multiplicity of interpretations was not a weakness, but a strength. The story's flexibility allowed it to remain relevant across changing times and contexts, providing what different communities needed from it. For enslaved people in the 1840s, it offered hope that bondage was not absolute. For their descendants in the 1870s, it validated their survival and resilience. For those facing Jim Crow oppression in the early 1900s, it reminded them of their ancestors' strength. For civil rights activists in the 1960s, it symbolized the possibility of transformative change. The story lived because it could adapt while maintaining its essential truth about human dignity, resistance, and the refusal to accept injustice. Marcus's dissertation was later published as a book, introducing Jacob Ellis's story to academic audiences who might not otherwise have encountered it. The book sparked discussions about how to properly study and interpret folklore, how to balance respect for oral traditions with scholarly rigor, how to recognize that stories serving spiritual and emotional needs might be just as true and valuable as stories that could be proven through documentary evidence. The late 20th century brought new technologies that changed how stories were preserved and transmitted. Audio and video recordings captured elderly people sharing memories of the stories their parents and grandparents had told them about slavery times. Several of these recordings included versions of Jacob Ellis's story, preserving not just the words, but the voices, the rhythms of speech, the emotional tones that written texts could not fully capture. These recordings became treasured resources for researchers and family members, offering direct connections to people who had maintained oral traditions across generations. Jennifer Washington, the descendant of Moses who wrote about Jacob's story in the early 21st century, discovered one of these recordings in an archive at a Louisiana university. The recording featured her great-aunt, a woman who had died in 1973, telling the story exactly as she had learned it from Moses himself. Hearing her aunt's voice speak the familiar words created a powerful sense of connection across time. Jennifer felt as if the story existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously. The events of 1842, the countless retellings across generations, the preservation in recordings and books, and the ongoing relevance to contemporary struggles for justice and dignity. Jennifer's book about Jacob Ellis included extensive discussion of how the story had been used, interpreted, and transformed over more than 150 years. She argued that the tale's endurance demonstrated something important about human nature and cultural memory. People needed stories that helped them make sense of suffering and injustice, that provided frameworks for understanding resistance and survival, that suggested possibilities beyond what dominant power structures claimed was possible. Jacob Ellis's vanishing, whether literal or metaphorical, whether supernatural or cleverly orchestrated, served these needs across generations. The book found readers far beyond Louisiana, reaching people around the world who saw parallels between the American slavery experience and other forms of oppression and resistance. Scholars in Africa, the Caribbean, Latin America, and elsewhere found resonance in the story of a man who refused to accept his bondage and found a way to freedom through mysterious means. The tale became part of global conversations about slavery, resistance, memory, and the power of storytelling to preserve dignity and hope under terrible circumstances.